January 30th, 1944. Bougainville Island, South Pacific. 5 modified Stuart tanks rolled toward a Japanese fortress system the Americans called the Hornet's Nest. Bunkers so well built that artillery bounced off, so expertly camouflaged that bombers couldn't find them, so cleverly positioned with interlocking fire that every approach became a killing ground. For weeks, conventional weapons had failed. Infantry assaults had been thrown back with heavy losses. Flamethrower operators who got close enough to burn the bunkers rarely survived to see their work succeed. But these 5 Stuarts carried something different. Inside their cramped hulls, engineers had mounted flame projectors where machine guns should have been, a desperate field modification born from watching too many men die carrying portable flamethrowers. Nobody knew if the improvisation would work in combat. The tanks had been tested in demonstrations, but demonstrations weren't bullets and fire and men trying to kill you. By sunset on January 30th, the Hornet's Nest had ceased to exist. Approximately 27 to 28 bunkers were destroyed. Around 14 of them burned out by the modified tanks. The weapon that military planners had been skeptical about had proven itself in the most brutal testing ground imaginable. Close combat against an enemy who had made themselves experts at defensive warfare. This is the story of how that happened, how desperation bred innovation, how 4 men died and 1 man earned the Medal of Honor proving a concept, and how a crude modification made in a rear area workshop changed the way America would fight every fortified island from Bougainville to Iwo Jima. The M1 flamethrower arrived in American arsenals in 1942, rushed into production after the realization that both Germany and Japan had been developing flame weapons while America slept through the 1930s. The design seemed straightforward enough. 2 gasoline tanks strapped to a soldier's back, a compressed nitrogen cylinder providing pressure, a handheld wand with nozzle and ignition system. Technical specifications claimed it could project burning liquid approximately 20 yards forward. Reality in the Pacific Theater told a different story. Fully loaded, the M1 weighed over 60 pounds. The operator became slow, burdened, awkward in movement. The weapon's ignition system relied on electric spark, or pilot flame, and in the damp jungle conditions, malfunctions occurred with disturbing frequency. According to reports from units using the M1, some operators resorted to carrying cigarette lighters as backup ignition sources, an unofficial field modification that revealed just how unreliable the standard system could be. The pressure system proved weak, leading to inconsistent fuel flow. Sometimes flames shot out effectively. Other times the stream sputtered or died entirely. In the worst scenarios, fuel leaks combined with ignition failures could engulf the operator himself in the fire meant for enemy positions. But even when the M1 functioned exactly as designed, it came with a fundamental problem that no engineering could solve. Accounts from infantry units in the Pacific suggest that flamethrower operators understood their situation clearly. One report from the Bougainville campaign includes what may have been a typical sentiment. The moment you put on that equipment, you became the target every enemy soldier wanted dead first. Slow-moving, highly visible, and the instant you fired, every Japanese defender within sight knew exactly where you were. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized eliminating flamethrower threats before they could close to effective range. Training manuals captured later in the war specifically instructed machine gunners to prioritize the distinctive silhouette of soldiers carrying fuel tanks. The reasoning was sound. A flamethrower could clear a bunker that might otherwise hold for days, so killing the operator before he could use the weapon was tactically essential. Statistics from Pacific campaigns bore this out grimly. Flamethrower operators faced some of the shortest life expectancies of any combat specialty. The weapons were necessary for reducing fortified positions, but using them meant accepting heavy casualties among the men carrying them. Yet despite all these drawbacks, flamethrowers remained indispensable. The Japanese had made defensive fortifications into an art form. Bunkers and cave systems held by small forces could resist much larger attacking units indefinitely. Artillery couldn't penetrate the reinforced structures. Airstrikes couldn't locate targets hidden under jungle canopy. Infantry couldn't suppress positions well enough to assault them without prohibitive losses. Fire worked differently. It didn't need clear sight lines to be effective. It flowed into every opening, spread through connected positions, and consumed oxygen defenders needed to survive. A bunker that could withstand a dozen artillery shells would become uninhabitable when flame found its way inside. The question facing American commanders was brutally simple. How do you preserve the flame's effectiveness while protecting the man who has to carry it close enough to use it? Late summer 1943, on the island of New Caledonia, someone asked that question out loud, and someone else had an answer that seemed both obvious and impossible. New Caledonia sat far enough behind the fighting to be relatively safe, but close enough that reports from the front lines arrived quickly. July 1943 had brought the battle for New Georgia, where American forces encountered Japanese defenders so deeply entrenched that conventional weapons seemed almost useless. The casualty lists grew longer. The lessons arrived written in blood. Well-built bunkers could hold indefinitely against everything except direct assault, and direct assault meant losses that were hard to sustain. The 754th Tank Battalion was training on New Caledonia that summer, preparing for operations scheduled later in the year. Historical records suggest that someone in the battalion, accounts point toward Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart, though documentation isn't entirely definitive, observed infantrymen training with M1 flamethrowers and recognized the core problem. The weapon worked. The man carrying it usually died. What if you could mount the flamethrower inside a tank? The idea seemed to solve the fundamental issue. Tank armor would protect the operator from the small arms fire that had been killing flamethrower troops. Tank mobility would close distance to enemy fortifications more safely than a man could on foot. Keep the fire's effectiveness, eliminate the operator's vulnerability. In concept, it made immediate sense. In practice, the engineering challenges seemed nearly insurmountable. The M3A1 Stuart light tank's interior was cramped even for its standard crew of 4 operating the main gun and machine guns. The thought of somehow fitting an entire flamethrower system, fuel tanks, pressure equipment, projector mechanism, into that confined space appeared almost impossible. Every available inch was already allocated to crew positions, ammunition storage, or mechanical systems, but impossible and necessary often occupy the same space during wartime. The invasion of Bougainville was scheduled for November 1st. Intelligence suggested the Japanese would be heavily entrenched. Flamethrowers would certainly be needed, and men carrying those flamethrowers would die unless something changed. Near Noumea, New Caledonia's capital, engineers began experimental work. They started by examining the M1A1 flamethrower, a slightly improved version of the original M1, and determining what could be shortened, reduced, or reconfigured. The barrel was cut down to save space. Fuel tank dimensions were calculated to see if smaller versions could fit, while providing adequate capacity. Every component underwent assessment for whether it could somehow be crammed into the Stuarts' tight interior. The solution they eventually reached involved careful compromises. 2 5-gallon gasoline canisters would replace the M1's original larger fuel tanks. Reduced capacity, but enough for combat operations. One canister could fit under the bow gunner's seat. Another could occupy space normally used for ammunition storage. The flame gun itself, shortened and modified, could be mounted to fire through the Stuart's .30 caliber ball mount, the opening normally used for the bow machine gun. It was crude, it was improvised, it had never been combat tested. But by October 1943, several modified Stuart tanks were ready for evaluation. A demonstration was arranged near Noumea. Officers from American, Australian, and New Zealand forces gathered to observe these experimental weapons fire. The flame projection functioned, Pressurized fuel sprayed through the ball mount, ignited properly, and reached distances that would be effective against bunker targets. The armor protected the crew as intended. The concept, improbable as it seemed, actually worked in controlled conditions. The modified Stuarts were transferred to the 3rd Marine Tank Battalion with expectations they would be employed in the upcoming Bougainville landing. However, preparation took longer than anticipated. The tanks needed further refinement. Crews required training on equipment that behaved differently from standard tanks. When the November 1st landing commenced and secured a beachhead at Empress Augusta Bay, the flame tanks weren't yet ready for deployment. Refinement continued through late 1943 and into January 1944. By then, the initial beachhead had been established, but remained under constant pressure from Japanese forces attempting to push the Americans back into the sea. The 754th Tank Battalion, under Major Reino Leightonen's command, arrived on Bougainville with their modified Stuarts. The improvised flame tanks were about to face their first real test against a target that had already earned a fearsome reputation, a defensive network of American infantry called the Hornet's Nest. The Hornet's Nest wasn't a single position. It was a defensive system, a network of bunkers stretching from the east bank of the Torokina River to the village of Mavavia. Japanese defenders, elements of the 2nd Battalion, 4th South Seas Garrison, had constructed fortifications that represented some of the finest defensive engineering in the Pacific War. Each bunker was built from heavy logs arranged in multiple layers, with earth packed between them for additional strength. The roofs were thick enough that artillery shells either detonated harmlessly on the surface or buried themselves in earth without penetrating. The walls provided similar protection, creating structures capable of absorbing tremendous punishment without failing. But structural strength was only part of the design. The bunkers were positioned to provide mutual support, with carefully planned fields of fire that overlapped. An attack on one position would immediately come under fire from at least 2 others. The approaches were covered by machine guns positioned to create kill zones, where advancing infantry would be exposed from multiple angles simultaneously. All of this was hidden with expert camouflage. The Japanese had become masters at blending fortifications into jungle terrain. Bunkers were built to merge with the landscape, covered with vegetation that made them nearly invisible beyond a few dozen yards. From the air they were completely undetectable. Observers and pilots saw only unbroken jungle canopy. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had learned these facts through costly experience. Early assault attempts had been repulsed with heavy casualties. Artillery bombardments seemed ineffective. Shells exploded in the jungle without hitting bunkers that couldn't be precisely located. Airstrikes were called off because pilots couldn't identify targets through thick foliage. Infantry with portable M1 flamethrowers achieved some success when they could close to effective range, but reaching that range meant crossing open ground under fire from multiple positions. Reports from these operations indicate that flamethrower operators became priority targets, and casualties among these troops were severe. The situation demanded a different approach. General John Hodge, commanding the Americal Division, made the decision to commit elements of the 754 Tank Battalion to the assault, including several of the flame-equipped M3A1 Stuarts. The plan called for combined arms coordination. Flame tanks would lead the assault, using their armor protection to close with bunker positions while projecting fire through any openings. Infantry would follow close behind with demolition teams prepared to finish any bunker that survived the initial burning. Success required precise timing and communication, and depended entirely on whether the improvised weapons would actually function under combat conditions. Nobody could be certain. The modifications had been tested in demonstrations, but demonstrations weren't combat. Fuel systems might fail. Ignition might not work in humid conditions. Armor might prove inadequate against Japanese anti-tank weapons. Crews might be unable to coordinate with infantry in battle chaos. January 30th, 1944 would provide all the answers. Dawn came slowly to Bougainville on January 30th. At 7:45 a.m., mortars from the 82nd Chemical Mortar Battalion began firing smoke rounds, creating thick screens that drifted across approaches to the Hornet's nest. The smoke was intended to blind Japanese observers, make it harder for them to direct fire against advancing forces. Following the smoke came 81mm mortars and artillery, pounding jungle areas where intelligence suggested bunker positions might be located. At 8:30 a.m., Company C of the 132nd Infantry Regiment began their advance. The modified Stuart tanks moved forward first, their engines producing a slightly different sound than standard tanks. The additional weight of fuel and flamethrower equipment changed their acoustic signature. Behind them, infantrymen advanced in skirmish lines, trying to maintain proximity to the tanks for protection while keeping enough spacing to avoid clustering. Morning air filled with cordite smoke and the sharp chemical smell of burning white phosphorus from smoke mortars. Artillery created constant background noise that made communication difficult. Officers had to shout orders that were barely audible to men standing directly beside them. What might have gone through an infantryman's mind as he followed those modified tanks? Perhaps something like, "These weren't normal Stuarts. You could see the modifications, something different about the bow, the way they moved." Word had spread that they could project flame, but seeing it in demonstration wasn't the same as combat. Belief would come when, if, they proved themselves under fire. The flame tanks advanced slowly, carefully, crews scanning for bunker positions that were almost impossible to detect until they were close enough to be targeted. The armor protected them from rifle bullets and machine gun rounds, but crews understood that Japanese anti-tank weapons or well-placed artillery could still destroy them. Just after 9 a.m., disaster struck with the sound of tearing metal. An American artillery shell, fired in support, meant to suppress Japanese positions, struck one of the leading Stuart tanks. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. The tank erupted in flames, fuel and ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions that sent black smoke boiling upward through the jungle canopy. Sergeant Minor J. Hall, the tank commander, was killed instantly. The shell struck with such force and unfortunate placement that he likely had no awareness it was American artillery that killed him. The other two crewmen, severely wounded and burning, attempted to escape the inferno consuming their vehicle. Corporal Joe Simon somehow escaped the burning tank. Historical accounts aren't entirely clear whether he jumped clear or was thrown out by the explosion. What is documented is that he got out, saw his crewmates still trapped inside, heard their screams, and made the decision to go back. He ran toward the flames. Japanese machine gunners, observing the confusion caused by the artillery strike, opened fire. Simon was hit multiple times and went down. He would later be posthumously awarded the Silver Star for attempting a rescue that was doomed from the moment it began. The impact of that moment rippled through the attacking American forces. The first casualty had come from friendly fire. The Japanese hadn't even needed to destroy the tank. American artillery had done it for them. Morale wavered. Some soldiers might have wondered if the entire assault should be called off. But someone, multiple officers probably, made the decision to continue. The remaining 4 flame tanks pressed forward. Infantry followed, though the friendly fire incident had disrupted formations and created temporary chaos. Japanese defensive fire intensified as machine guns and rifles opened up from bunkers that remained invisible to the attackers. Men were pinned down, caught in crossfire from positions they couldn't identify well enough to effectively return fire against. Some were wounded, lying exposed where retrieving them meant crossing ground actively being swept by enemy fire. Staff Sergeant Jesse Drowley, positioned with Company B nearby, heard screaming. Not from the burning tank. Those men were beyond help. From infantry caught in Japanese crossfire, wounded and unable to move to safety. Records indicate what Drowley did next. He saw men pinned down, saw bullets cutting through foliage around them. Saw that nobody was moving to help because moving meant exposing yourself to fire from multiple directions. Jesse Drowley moved anyway. What he did wasn't tactically sophisticated. It was refusing to accept that men would die because the situation seemed impossible. He broke cover, sprinted across open ground that Japanese machine gunners were actively sweeping, and somehow avoided the bullets that should have hit him. He reached wounded soldiers, grabbed them, dragged them back toward cover. How he survived that first rescue remains unclear. Witnesses reported seeing bullets strike the ground around him, rounds cutting through brush near his position. By any rational calculation, he should have been hit. But he kept moving, kept pulling wounded men out, and somehow made it back. That was only the beginning of what Jesse Drowley would do that day. While Drowley was conducting his rescues, the flame tanks were beginning to prove their worth. The modified Stuarts closed with Japanese bunker positions, their armor absorbing machine gun fire that would have killed infantrymen instantly. Bow gunners positioned their flame projectors, aimed at dark openings of bunker firing slits, and activated their weapons. Flame roared outward in arcing streams. When ignition systems functioned properly, pressurized fuel created jets of fire that reached into bunker interiors through gun ports, ventilation gaps, and entranceways. The effect was immediate and devastating. Timber structures that had withstood artillery bombardment became furnaces when flame found them. The heat became unbearable. Smoke turned suffocating. Japanese defenders inside had perhaps seconds to escape before positions became unlivable. But the weapons remained improvised, crude, still prone to malfunctions that had plagued portable flamethrowers. One modified Stuart closed on a bunker that had been suppressing American infantry for hours. The bow gunner lined up his shot, activated fuel flow, and squeezed the ignition trigger. Fuel sprayed outward in a pressurized stream, liquid visible as it arced towards the bunker's gun ports and firing slits. But no flame followed. The ignition had failed. Inside the Stuart, the flamethrower operator faced an immediate problem. He'd just soaked the bunker interior with gasoline. Japanese soldiers inside knew what was supposed to happen next, were probably repositioning to exploit the malfunction, might be preparing to counterattack while the American tank was vulnerable. What happened next isn't captured in official records with complete clarity, but the outcome was unmistakable. Somehow, whether through a backup ignition method, an improvised incendiary device, or desperate fieldcraft that nobody documented precisely, the crew found a way to ignite the fuel they'd sprayed. This may have required briefly exposing themselves to throw something towards the fuel-soaked bunker, a risk that would explain why accounts from that day mention extraordinary courage under fire. The bunker erupted in flames within seconds. The ignition source, whatever it was, hit gasoline vapor and liquid fuel simultaneously. The structure didn't simply catch fire, it became an instant furnace. Flame roared back out through every opening, followed by smoke so thick and black it could be seen from hundreds of yards away. Japanese defenders inside likely had no time to understand what was happening before fire consumed everything. The operator dropped back inside the tank and secured the hatch. Stuart moved on toward the next target. Behind it, the bunker burned with such intensity that the timber structure began collapsing. The assault continued through the morning, flame tanks and infantry developing coordination that improved with each bunker cleared. The doctrine was being written in real time. Tanks would advance and use flame to suppress or destroy positions. Infantry would follow close behind to finish with demolition charges or grenades, anything that survived initial burning. At 10:30 a.m., the Japanese counterattacked. They emerged from positions Americans hadn't yet identified, carrying improvised gasoline bombs, bottles filled with fuel, cloth wicks stuffed in tops. Mortars opened fire with pre-registered coordinates, shells falling among advancing American forces with accuracy suggesting the Japanese had planned this response specifically. Second Lieutenant John White was directing his infantry squad when a mortar round landed close enough that shrapnel found gaps in his equipment. He went down, mortally wounded. Sergeant James Jarman, seeing his lieutenant fall, attempted to reach him to provide aid. Jarman died trying, hit by fire from a position that seemed to materialize from the jungle itself. But the most dangerous threat wasn't the counterattack. It was a machine gun position nobody had spotted, camouflaged so expertly in jungle terrain that it had remained invisible through the entire morning's assault. The gun was positioned with clear fields of fire across routes American forces were using to advance. It was cutting down soldiers who couldn't even identify where bullets were coming from. Infantry couldn't pinpoint the position. The jungle was too thick, the gun's muzzle flash too brief and well concealed. Tank crews, buttoned up inside armor with limited visibility through vision ports and periscopes, couldn't see it at all. Men were dying from an enemy they couldn't locate. Jesse Drowley spotted the muzzle flash pattern that revealed the hidden position. He was bleeding from wounds sustained earlier, half-deaf from explosions, but his eyes still worked. He saw what trained observers had missed, the subtle patterns that indicated where the gun was firing from. He ran toward the nearest flame tank, not away from danger but directly toward it, crossing ground the machine gun was actively sweeping. Bullets struck around him, ricocheted off rocks, cut through vegetation. He reached the Stuarts' hull and climbed onto the deck while Japanese fire sparked off armor plating around him. Staff Sergeant Drowley hammered on the turret with his rifle butt, the only communication method with any chance of working over combat noise. Inside the tank, the crew heard banging, understood someone outside was trying to convey something urgent, but couldn't make out any specific message through armor and engine roar. The flame operator couldn't see what Drowley was pointing at through limited vision his gun sight provided. He fired where Drowley seemed to indicate, sending burning fuel toward jungle vegetation. It hit trees, bushes, nothing vital. The machine gun kept firing. Men kept dying. It's possible Drowley was shouting, cursing, pointing frantically at a target the crew couldn't see precisely enough through their gun sights to hit based on hand signals alone. The coordination wasn't working. They were trying, but visibility limitations were insurmountable. Drowley looked around desperately and saw a Thompson submachine gun near a wounded soldier. He grabbed it, checked the magazine. Some Thompson magazines in Pacific operations were loaded with tracer rounds, ammunition that burned bright enough to mark its trajectory through daylight, used for signaling or adjusting fire. This magazine contained tracers. Jesse Drowley positioned himself on the tank's deck, fully upright, completely exposed where every Japanese soldier with line of sight could shoot at him, and began firing tracer rounds toward the machine gun nest. Glowing bullets drew a visible line through air, a path the flame tank crew could follow. It was brilliant improvisation. It was also suicidal. Japanese machine gunners, seeing this American standing on a tank deck firing at them, shifted aim towards him. They hit him. Bullets struck his chest and face. Blood poured from wounds that should have dropped him immediately. But Jesse Drowley kept firing tracers, kept marking the target, even as his vision narrowed and his legs began failing. The flame tank crew, finally seeing the glowing trajectory of tracer rounds, understood. They adjusted aim, following the path Drowley had marked, and fired. Flame found the position. Not a brief burst, a sustained stream lasting several seconds, covering the area where the machine gun had been positioned. The Japanese gun stopped firing. The position that had killed dozens of Americans that morning became a pyre, smoke rising thick and black from vegetation that burned despite humid jungle air. Drowley collapsed on the tank deck. Medics rushed forward, had to climb onto the tank to reach him where he'd fallen. According to later accounts, medics attempted to evacuate him immediately. He refused. Reports suggest he insisted that someone verify the enemy position was completely destroyed before he would accept treatment. He was bleeding from chest and face wounds, could barely see, but wouldn't allow himself to be moved until other soldiers confirmed the machine gun nest was eliminated. Only when confirmation came that the position was silent and burning did he finally permit medics to carry him away. Jesse Drowley survived his wounds. Months later, he would stand before President Franklin D. Roosevelt and receive the Medal of Honor for his actions on January 30th, 1944. But at that moment, as medics carried Drowley away, the battle for the Hornet's nest continued. By early afternoon, the flame tanks had consumed their fuel supplies and exhausted their compressed nitrogen pressure. Each flame burst lasted approximately 20 seconds, and the modified Stuarts carried limited fuel capacity compared to purpose-built flame tanks that would be developed later. Supply lines back to American positions ran through jungle terrain under sporadic Japanese fire. The tanks withdrew to refuel and repressurize. Crews worked quickly, hand-pumping gasoline into the tank's fuel canisters, replacing nitrogen cylinders, checking ignition systems and fuel lines for damage or malfunction. The work proceeded under pressure. Every minute flame tanks were out of action was a minute infantry faced bunkers without the one weapon proving most effective. At 1:30 p.m., the flame tanks returned to the front line and rejoined the assault. What followed was systematic dismantling of what remained of the Hornet's nest. Morning combat had taught both forces how to work as one. Tank infantry teams moved methodically through the bunker network, tanks advancing to point-blank range, sometimes within 10 or 15 yards, pouring fire through any opening. Infantry followed close behind with demolition charges to finish positions that survived, ready to suppress any Japanese who attempted escape. If you could have asked an infantryman there how it felt, he might have said something like, "It wasn't the tanks alone or the infantry alone, it was both together. Tanks could close and burn without exposing operators to the fire that had been killing flamethrower troops. Infantry could move up behind armor, finish the work. Either force alone would likely have failed. Together they were breaking the fortress." The character of battle changed as afternoon wore on. Sharp crack of rifles and hammering of machine guns gave way to roar of flamethrowers and deeper explosions of demolition charges. The smell changed too, cordite and gunpowder replaced by heavier scents of burning wood, gasoline, and things worse than either. By late afternoon, the count stood at approximately 27 to 28 bunkers destroyed. Exact tallies were difficult in the chaos of jungle combat. Around 14 were credited directly to flame-equipped tanks. The remainder fell to combinations of portable M1 flamethrowers operated by infantry, rifle fire, mortar strikes, and demolition charges placed by soldiers who could approach only after flame tanks had suppressed positions. The Hornet's nest, the position that had held against weeks of conventional assault, had ceased to exist as a defensive system in less than one day. Where bunkers had stood that morning, only scorched earth and collapsed timber remained. A smoke smell hung over everything, thick enough that soldiers wrapped cloth around faces to breathe more easily. Japanese defenders who had believed themselves secure in their reinforced positions had discovered that timber fortifications, regardless how expertly built, became ovens when fire found them. The cost had been significant. 4 Americans lay dead. Hall and Simon from the morning's tragic beginning, White and Jarman from the Japanese counterattack. Dozens of others were wounded, including Jesse Drowley, who survived through remarkable fortune and medical care. But the flame tanks had proven their worth beyond question. The concept that had seemed like desperate improvisation in New Caledonia had demonstrated in combat that armor combined with flame weapons could break defensive systems. Conventional weapons couldn't touch without prohibitive casualties. Reports going up the chain of command that night carried statistics that demanded attention. The ratio of American casualties taking positions with flame tank support versus conventional assault methods was stark enough that even cautious military planners had to acknowledge something significant had occurred on January 30th, 1944. The battle for the Hornet's nest accomplished something beyond taking one defensive position on one jungle island. It validated a concept military planners had been skeptical about, that flame weapons mounted in armored vehicles could break fortified positions that artillery, airstrikes, and infantry assault couldn't reduce without unacceptable losses. After-action reports reached higher command within days. The statistics couldn't be dismissed. 14 bunkers destroyed by flame tanks. Casualty ratios showing tank infantry teams reduced fortifications faster and with fewer losses than any previous method attempted. The modified Stuarts had suffered damage, including one tank lost to friendly fire, but they'd survived encounters that would have killed dozens of exposed flamethrower operators. More significantly, flame tanks had changed the tactical equation. Japanese defenders who could hold bunkers indefinitely against conventional weapons had been routed in hours when fire found them. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. Soldiers who had felt invulnerable in reinforced positions learned that flame could reach them anywhere. The speed of official adoption was remarkable by military standards. What started as one officer's improvisation became validated doctrine in a single day of combat. Typically, new weapons require years for testing, evaluation, and fielding. The flame tank progressed from concept to combat proven in months because the need was desperate and results were undeniable. By mid-1944, purpose-built flame tanks were entering American arsenals. The Satan flame tank, based directly on lessons learned from the modified Stuarts, arrived in time for assaults on Saipan and Guam. These purpose-built versions corrected the improvised nature of Bougainville modifications. Larger fuel capacity allowed longer operational periods. Refined ignition systems reduced malfunctions. Better armor protection covered vulnerabilities combat had revealed. Tactical doctrine evolved with each island battle. Saipan taught the importance of better infantry tank communication systems than hammering on armor with rifle butts. Guam demonstrated how flame tanks could clear cave systems where Japanese defenders retreated after surface fortifications were destroyed. Tinian showed effectiveness against fortified villages where buildings had been converted into defensive positions. By February 1945, when American forces landed on Iwo Jima, flame tank infantry teams operated with precision developed through repeated combat and shared understanding built across multiple campaigns. The modified Stuart tanks that had seemed so experimental on Bougainville had spawned an entire tactical approach that became as essential to Pacific operations as naval gunfire support and air superiority. Statistics told the story clearly. Operations using flame tanks experienced significantly lower infantry casualties when reducing fortified positions. Time required to clear defensive systems dropped dramatically. Japanese defenders who had held positions for days or weeks against conventional assault often collapsed in hours when flame tanks arrived. Documentation of Japanese perspectives on flame tanks is limited, but what exists suggests they recognized the weapon's effectiveness. Some captured documents and post-war interviews indicate Japanese defenders understood they had no effective counter to armored flame projection. Bunkers that could withstand artillery became death traps when fire found them. The legacy extended beyond any single battle or campaign. The modified Stuart that had been a desperate gamble on January 30th, 1944, spawned an entire weapons category. Flame tanks became standard equipment for Pacific operations, as fundamental to planning as ammunition supplies and medical support. What one officer had proposed in New Caledonia after witnessing New Georgia's carnage had fundamentally changed how America fought the island war. The Sherman tank, larger and better armored than the Stuart, became the primary platform for American flame tanks in later operations. Models like the POA-CWS variant carried substantially more fuel and could sustain flame projection for longer periods. But all traced their lineage back to the improvised Stuarts, modified in New Caledonia. From concept to combat validation to widespread doctrine took less than a year. From skepticism to acceptance, from improvisation to standard equipment, from field modification to purpose-built weapons systems, the transformation was extraordinarily rapid by military standards because the need was desperate and results spoke for themselves with undeniable clarity. In discussions of tactical innovations and doctrine changes, the human cost can become abstracted into statistics. 4 men died on January 30th, 1944, during the assault on the Hornet's nest, helping prove a concept that would save thousands of other lives in battles yet to come. Sergeant Minor J. Hall died to friendly fire before the weapon he'd helped test ever proved itself in combat. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that American artillery, supporting fire meant to protect advancing troops, killed him instead. Hall likely had no awareness of what hit him, no moment to understand, died instantly when the modified Stuart he commanded erupted in flames. Corporal Joe Simon died attempting what soldiers do, refusing to leave comrades behind. He escaped the burning tank, reached safety, then made the conscious decision to go back for crew members still trapped inside. Japanese machine gunners who shot him down were executing their tactical responsibilities, but Simon's death came while attempting a rescue that defined the bonds soldiers form in combat. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star as recognition for heroism that cost his life. Second Lieutenant John White and Sergeant James Jarman fell to the Japanese counterattack at mid-morning. White was directing his infantry squad when mortar fire found him. Jarman died attempting to reach his wounded lieutenant. Their deaths were the kind that occur in every assault. Soldiers killed by an enemy fighting just as determinedly to hold ground as the Americans were to take it. These 4 names deserve remembrance. They were part of the price of innovation in warfare, part of the cost paid to learn what worked and what didn't against an enemy proven expert at defensive operations. It's straightforward to discuss flame tanks and tactical innovations and doctrine changes in abstract terms. It's more difficult to remember that every breakthrough in combat is purchased with blood. How many hundreds or thousands of other soldiers survived later battles because of what was learned on January 30th, 1944? The exact number can't be calculated, but evidence suggests it was significant. The flame tank concept these 4 men died helping to prove saved lives at Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. That doesn't make their deaths less tragic, but it does mean their sacrifice carried meaning beyond that single day. Staff Sergeant Jesse Drowley survived to receive the Medal of Honor from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The official citation described his actions in formal military language, risked life rescuing wounded under fire, exposed himself to direct enemy fire, directed tank fire while seriously wounded, refused evacuation until certain the position was secure. Citations written in official language can never fully capture what it means to make the decisions Drowley made that day. To run into fire pulling wounded to safety, to climb onto a tank deck while bullets actively seek you, to fire tracer rounds marking enemy positions after you've been shot in the chest and face, to refuse medical care until you're absolutely certain the threat is eliminated. The Medal of Honor was deserved, but no medal adequately represents that level of courage. The Japanese defenders in the Hornet's nest also deserve acknowledgement. They built their fortifications expertly, positioned them with tactical skill, defended them with determination that lasted until the positions themselves became unlivable. They fought from bunkers that became ovens, held their ground against overwhelming firepower, and died largely to the last man rather than surrender. The flame tanks that broke their defenses didn't diminish their courage. It simply made American victory possible against an enemy that might otherwise have held indefinitely. War extracts brutal prices from all participants. Both sides in brutal conflicts pay terrible costs. The flame tanks that burned Japanese defenders from their bunkers were effective precisely because they were so devastating, because they turned fortified positions into death traps. Japanese soldiers who died in those bunkers faced deaths that were mercifully quick, but horrible nonetheless. Recognition of tactical necessity doesn't require celebrating the suffering of any human being caught in fire they couldn't escape. The Stuart flame tanks that fought on January 30th, 1944 represented desperate innovation. Shortened barrels, improvised fuel systems, equipment crammed into spaces never designed for it. They were born from watching too many flamethrower operators die trying to reduce fortifications with portable weapons that exposed them to concentrated enemy fire. Within months, American engineers produced purpose-built versions correcting every flaw Bougainville combat had revealed. Larger fuel capacity allowed longer operations without refueling. Reliable ignition systems reduced malfunctions. Improved armor protection covered vulnerabilities. Combat experience had identified. Better coordination systems allowed tank crews and infantry to communicate more effectively than hammering on armor with rifle butts. The doctrine proved durable across different campaigns and even different wars. Close coordination between flame tanks and infantry remained essential, whether fighting on Pacific Islands or in Korean mountains. The use of armor to protect flame operators while closing with fortified positions remained the core principle. The recognition that some defensive systems could only be defeated by bringing fire directly to them under armored protection never stopped being tactically valid. Flame tanks appeared in Korea when fortified positions again required weapons, combining armor and incendiary capability. The lessons from Bougainville, tanks leading, infantry following, combined arms coordination, remained valid against a different enemy in different terrain. Even in Vietnam's different tactical environment, flame tanks served when bunker complexes required reduction and conventional weapons proved insufficient. But weapons don't win battles by themselves. The flame tank was metal, fuel, and fire. What made it effective on January 30th, 1944, was soldiers like Jesse Drowley who refused to accept impossible situations, engineers who solved problems nobody had trained them for, and infantrymen who followed armored fire into positions that would have been suicidal to assault any other way. Today, restored flame tanks sit in museums, their fuel systems drained and disabled, their armor no longer protecting anyone. Plaques explain technical specifications and list battle honors. Visitors can walk around them, see the shortened flame gun barrel protruding from the bow, imagine what crewing one in combat must have been like, or what following one into assault must have felt like. Standing beside a restored flame tank, you can understand something of what Japanese defenders must have experienced, seeing these modified Stuarts approach their positions. The bulk of fuel tanks are visible through open hatches. The knowledge that this machine carried fire, it could project with deadly accuracy. The recognition that timber fortifications, regardless how expertly built, would become furnaces if flame found them. From one officer's suggestion in late summer 1943 to doctrine-shaping Pacific Island warfare took less than a year. From skepticism to acceptance, improvisation to standard equipment, field modification to purpose-built weapons systems, the transformation was extraordinarily rapid because need was desperate and results spoke with undeniable clarity. But innovations in war always carry prices paid in blood. Minor Hall, Joe Simon, John White, James Jarman, they paid it on January 30th, 1944. So did the Japanese defenders who died in bunkers that became furnaces. The flame tank worked. It broke the Hornet's nest. It changed Pacific warfare, and the men who proved it paid with their lives or their blood to purchase that knowledge. War drives innovation faster than peace ever could. Desperation breeds solutions peacetime engineering might never attempt. The Stuart flame tank was born from both. Desperation meeting innovation on a jungle island where American infantry was dying against fortifications. Conventional weapons couldn't break without unacceptable casualties. What emerged from that desperation was a weapon that worked when nothing else would. Fire met steel on January 30th, 1944, in a battle most people have never heard of, for a position whose name, the Hornet's Nest, is forgotten outside military histories. But the legacy endures in ways both tangible and subtle. Every flame tank that served from Bougainville to Okinawa, every fortified position that fell to fire where conventional weapons had failed, every American soldier who survived a battle because flame tanks could reduce bunkers without requiring infantry to assault them directly under fire. All of it traces back to that January morning when 5 modified Stuart tanks approached a Japanese fortress and proved that innovation born from desperation could fundamentally change how wars are fought. The Pacific War would never be the same after January 30th, 1944. The tactical lessons learned that day rippled forward through every subsequent island assault, every fortified position encountered, every time American forces faced an enemy that had made defensive warfare into an art form. And somewhere in the long historical record of weapons and tactics and innovations that brought the Pacific War to its conclusion, the improvised flame tanks of Bougainville deserve their place, not celebrated for the devastation they inflicted, because there's nothing to celebrate about any weapon of war, but remembered for the impossible problem they solved when conventional solutions had failed, and for the lives they saved by giving infantry a way to reduce fortifications without crossing kill zones under concentrated fire. The men who died proving the concept that morning paid the price of innovation. The men who survived to fight at Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, with flame tanks as standard equipment, were the beneficiaries of that price. War is brutal mathematics, trading lives now to save lives later, and there's no glory in those equations, only necessity, and the hope that the innovations purchased with blood prevent more blood from being spilled tomorrow. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing to our channel. We bring forgotten battles and unsung heroes back to life, telling the stories that shaped history but rarely make it into textbooks. New historical deep dives every week, because these stories deserve to be remembered, and the people who lived them deserve to be honored.